Yeah, well, I'm very, very happy indeed this evening to have some fantastic guests in the studio. We have Tom Lloyd, who is the former Chief Constable of Cambridgeshire with us, who is now an international drugs policy advisor and is an active campaigner for decriminalisation and controlled legalisation of drugs. We have Kevin Jaffray, a nationally respected Naloxone and drug and alcohol campaigner. Jude Duncan from CJIT, that's the Criminal Justice Drug Team. And we also have James here, who's somebody who's been affected by issues of recovery in various ways, who is going to contribute to the discussion. So maybe a quick introduction from guys, just to give what your position is and what you specifically like to talk about this evening. That'd be fantastic.
Well, thanks very much for inviting me, Mark. Lovely day here in Leicester. Just a pity we're broadcasting from the depths of the studio, but I sense a lot of energy today, and certainly it may be surprising to people thinking a former Chief Constable, 30 years as a cop, actually thinking that drug prohibition is a hugely costly, counterproductive and harmful failure, because that's what I believe. And it's urgent that we do something about it. I know that we'll be talking about recovery, but certainly one of the problems with drug prohibition is that it creates an environment where users are stigmatized. The police get on their backs. I mean, let's face it, if you've got a drug problem, the last thing you need is to get arrested. And frankly, if you haven't got a problem with your drug use, like 95% of people who take most drugs, then the last thing you need is to be arrested. So, from the inside, I saw how it really wasn't working. And that if we keep in our minds that what we should be doing is treating this like any other problem, trying to analyse it correctly, and then using solutions that might make a difference. And frankly, when you look at the evidence, what we have here is a huge illicit criminal market that's making billions of pounds every year in this country and hundreds of billions around the world. And yet our solution is to apply the same medicine, prohibition, that we've done for the last 40 years. I'll probably have an opportunity to talk about that in more detail as the show goes on, but I just wanted to make it clear that we've got to end prohibition for everybody's sake. And particularly, I think the focus today is those people struggling with their with problematic drug abuse are being served very badly by having to do that under prohibition.
Oh, it's fantastic. Thanks for that introduction. Kevin, if you'd just like to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Kevin Jaffray. I'm a national advocate for naloxone and various other things to do with the drug and alcohol sector. I'm totally on board with what Tom's just said. And actually find it quite weird to be sat here next to you, risked or anything like that. It's quite novel. It's quite novel.
Don't worry, I'll leave you alone. Don't worry.
It's even better knowing that I've got something. It's not getting taken off me. Do you know what I mean? But yeah, I've got a lot of campaigns going on at the moment. I've been involved in a lot of campaigns for the human rights of users. I think it's quite a pertinent sort of topic, and I'm kind of blessed to be here today to talk about it, and hopefully we'll get some points across to lovely Leicester out there. Got a soft spot for Leicester, I do.
Fantastic. And Jude, just like to introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Jude Duncan, and I work in Leicester, and I'm really interested in how it can be used in recovery and how it can benefit the drug using community, empower people to come into services, have a value and a worth.
Sorry, can I just interrupt you a moment? Can you see the green line on there? You need to make that green line jump up and down, because otherwise you're not being heard. So either raise your voice or hold the microphone close. Yeah?
Okay, thank you. Is that better? Yeah. That's better. Hey! Microphone. Shall I do it again? Shall I say it again? Yeah. Hi. My name's Jude Duncan, and I work in drug treatment services, and I've worked in drug treatment services for about 17 years now, and I'm really interested in the issue of naloxone and how it can help people be engaged in drug treatment services. It's a life-saving intervention, and how it can help people move on in terms of how they deal with their drug use and how they deal with services. So I'm quite interested in talking about that.
Thanks, Jude. James, do you just want to give a quick introduction?
Yeah, my name is James Frank, and I just want to say I recovered from mental illness and from drug use, and if I can help people to recover as well, I'm quite happy to help them in any way.
That's fantastic. Because that's what it's about as well, as much as we're talking about these issues. It's about people who have come through and survived. So that's fantastic, James. Cheers. So it's like, what you were saying, Tom, it's fantastic. I'm learning stuff all the time. I've been involved in campaigning myself with my recovery campaign. And it's such a massive subject. I learn stuff as I'm going along. And one of the issues in terms of legalisation, for example, I'm finding it increasingly convincing. Certainly when it comes to decriminalisation, I think, in terms of rather than treating people like criminals, like people with drink problems, for example, they're not criminals, even if they're dysfunctional. It's a health problem. It should be seen the same with users of illegal drugs. So I'm not against what you're saying at all. I'm becoming, like I said, increasingly convinced. But in terms of convincing the broader populace to get behind it, for example, if drugs are particularly blighting impoverished estates, if you're trying to convince people like that legalisation is a good idea, how would you respond to concerns like winning people over? It seems quite controversial initially.
Yeah, I mean, the opinion polls at the moment are showing that the general public is becoming increasingly dissatisfied with the current state of affairs, because if you think about, you mentioned maybe an estate blighted by drug problems, you've got to think about the drugs themselves are the worst possible quality because the criminals are in charge and they don't care, and the criminals are often, in inverted commas, running the estate. Now, people will be saying to me, what's your answer? And maybe I should just come to that straight away. And the answer for me is what I'd call legal regulation of drugs under the control of government. And by that I mean all drugs. If you think about the food we eat, the substances like coffee, alcohol, tobacco we consume, other soft drinks, everything, medicines, we know what's on the packet is what's inside the packet. And we don't know that with illicit drugs. And so it's always a lottery, which is why we're losing 1,000 people a year dying unnecessarily from opiate overdoses. And whilst we've got hepatitis C ravaging the intravenous drug injection community, and to a certain extent HIV, AIDS and other bloodborne diseases, it's all because this is an underground, uncontrolled, illicit market that's far more dangerous than it needs to be. If it was controlled and regulated, some people would say, oh, well, do you mean there's a free-for-all? And the answer to that is no, because I think it's important to, if you like, describe 4 levels of control that you could have over any substance. And one is complete prohibition, which is what we've got at the moment. You're just not allowed to produce it, supply it, or consume it. And that, for me, is the worst possible situation, because under prohibition, the criminals have made billions of pounds, dollars internationally, and people have suffered and died over the decades. Now, the second arrangement would be to decriminalise, which means, and this has happened in Portugal very successfully, with a huge reduction in cases of HIV/AIDS and addiction to heroin, and no subsequent increase in drug consumption. What they say is, if you have drugs in your possession for your personal use for up to about 10 days, then we won't criminalise you, we will send you for treatment if necessary. But that still leaves the criminals in charge of the illicit market. There's a third approach which I advocate, which is legal control and regulation. So something like cannabis and maybe ecstasy, relatively light controls, so that adults can buy them, not children, adults. Remember, at the moment, the dealer will sell you stuff, they don't look at your passport, they don't check your age, they just want to know if you've got your money. And anybody sitting around this table who knows anything about the scene should know that actually children are more vulnerable now, because the criminals will sell to them, than they would be, not a perfect system in the future, but they would be if there was some sort of regulation that I advocate. Regulation over access, regulation over purity, regulation over strength. And then the fourth option is a free-for-all. And I don't think that that is the way to go, because it's not the way we go with medicines. It's not the way we go with alcohol or tobacco or many other substances. We have age limits. So what I'm actually suggesting is something which is ultimately sensible and is increasingly backed by the evidence of countries that have decriminalised, where we have not seen a huge increase in use. And a couple of years ago, a Home Office report came out. Theresa May didn't want it to come out, but the Lib Dem who was in the office at the time pushed it. And they'd been to 20 different countries, and they showed that the level of law enforcement, drug law enforcement, whether it's high or whether it's low, has no bearing on the amount of drugs being consumed. What you've actually got is an irrelevance. And Theresa May herself, when she was talking to the Home Affairs Select Committee a couple of years ago, said, I've got no evidence that drug law enforcement works, I just believe it does. Now, when you've got a senior politician in charge of a policy who doesn't have the evidence, admits they don't have the evidence, and just believes it works, you know you're in trouble. So look, I could go on, and you're welcome to stop me and interrupt, but basically there is a growing understanding and well worked out way of regulating and controlling the drugs that are currently running amok. The people who are actually in control of drugs are the criminals, and no sensible citizen wants that to happen.
That's thanks, Tom. That's very, very interesting indeed. We're just going to have a few questions. Just bearing in mind, try and keep it relatively short because I haven't got a massive amount of time, unfortunately, and we still want Kevin to come in and Jude. So, a couple of questions here.
Okay. I'm just going to, expand upon that. I mean, because drugs at the low level do an immense amount of harm. Now, I was recently watching an interview with David Cornwell, John le Carre, on Democracy Now! And what he was putting forward, he was saying, like, in reality, you're seeing a lot of the profits from these going to the big banks and people like that. And I know it's a bit of a short thing. HSBC recently didn't do anti-laundering checks on $7 trillion. We're fined only $1 billion. And I'd also like to ask Kevin a question as well. Yeah, could you tell us a bit more about naloxone?
Right, naloxone. It's been a passion of mine because if you're looking for evidence that naloxone works, you're actually listening to him. I'm sitting here. My life was saved by naloxone on 5 separate occasions. And it became an interest of mine in the campaign back when it started as an interest in 2009. And then I moved into taking it more seriously in 2012. No.
No, I think it's okay. It's okay. No, it's okay.
Oh dear,
it's okay.
Hear that? I'm getting told to talk loud. I'm normally getting told to shut up. Right, so
no, not on this show. Not on this show.
Basically, in 2012, what happened was we launched another campaign. It's a global campaign as well. Drug deaths were going up. Some would say it's got something to do with the agenda in 2010 because it's not fit for purpose. But then it's a different conversation completely. I'm going to swallow them.
No, don't choke. Don't choke. Don't choke. We're not insured for choking here. Yeah.
So basically, what we did was we got a national campaign together, and we formed a group called the NAG, the Naloxone Action Group, or National Action Group, and that was basically made up of a lot of prominent people who had the same, like-minded people who had the same desire to get together and to help try and reduce the number of deaths. I think it's gone up by about 2/3. It's the highest ever recorded since 1999 at the moment, which is it's quite a scary fact considering that every single one of those deaths is preventable. And why can't we have it? I mean, what's the difference between that and an EpiPen? Basically, this is the argument. We can hand out EpiPens, we can hand out EpiPens to children, but we can't hand out a life-saving medication. It knocks on to the prohibition. Prohibition, can't even say it now. Been fighting against it so long, can't even say it. Fighting against the prohibition, it feeds into that with the medications. I mean, like 75% of the world can't even get their hands on morphine, painkiller, because of all this kind of stuff. And why is it so hard to get a life-saving medication? If it was something else in the public health sector, and no longer in the criminal justice sector, where it's been far too long, if it was in the public health sector and it was over there completely, then we might not have had to fight so much. But it's become a big, massive issue now, where people who have got no drug issues in the past, but they've been in hospital for cancer or something like that, and they've been on pain medication, they're getting asked if they want to take naloxone when they leave because they're on a pain medication which is quite strong. There are significant risks, and they're refusing to take it because it was so high profile and connected to drug users. Now this is where it's got to now. If it had just gone through smooth and been normalised straight in the beginning, it would have been okay, it would have been straight through, and nobody would be having this sort of, oh, I'm not touching that in case it gets seen as one of them out in the community.
But I mean, on several occasions I've heard you've mentioned about being, I mean, in terms of Tom, you know, obviously sharing with his past career, and then you obviously made it, okay, but we wouldn't have been speaking like this. Don't you think that in terms of that relationship between somebody like Tom, who kind of agrees with what you're saying, but you're both on two different sides of the fence? So don't you sometimes see that as being something where, because I know a lot of people would not speak to Tom, they probably won't speak to Tom for the amount of time they're going to spend on this earth.
I have to say that. I have to say that'd be their loss. I think.
You know what I mean?
I know there's a lot of barriers and there's a lot of ground to cover because it's a us and them sort of situation. Has been for years. But at the end of the day, all you got to do is listen to Tom for 10 minutes. And I listen to Leap. I've followed Leap for quite some time, and they're over in America. They're now over in Germany. They're expanding massively. And if you listen to them and listen to their manifesto, they're on point. They're bang on spot. And I mean,
I'll just give a quick. So the naloxone is basically if somebody has an opioid overdose. It's injected and brings them around.
If somebody has an opioid overdose, and the new scare that's possibly coming to Britain as well, that's the heroin, the opioid epidemic in America and over in Estonia, the fentanyl's coming over as well now. It'll reverse that. Just you might need a little bit more at the moment because of the strength of this new fentanyl that's coming. This double 18, it's like 10,000 times stronger than morphine. So we're looking at like. You can still use naloxone. For some reason it's stronger, but the naloxone will still work on that, yeah.
But I mean, in terms of, like, say, with the illegal highs and the fact they've just made illegal highs illegal, which in terms of listening to both of you now, listening to yourself, Tom, would have said that, okay, I would have kept them legal because now they've just made a big thing out of certain, or particular drugs within that category, which people are now going to see as like heroin or smack, because it's almost like giving birth to a new type of drug.
They've created a whole new market here, and this is alternative prohibition. If original drugs and the old school drugs weren't restricted, then there would be no need to go into this new market and provide this new market. But what's happened is we've gone into this new market, and what's happened is the first place that rolled that out with the public safety orders was Lincoln. Now, when they did their survey to see if they needed a programme like that, the survey was twisted. It wasn't sold as what it was meant to be. They didn't talk so much about the legal highs. It was more about the drink. So they've brought the new thing in. Now, a year down the line, they're still selling this as a perfect sort of solution because they've cleaned up the town centre. But I spoke to like frontliners on the ground and that, and they're round the edge of the town centre where you've got kids now making the NPSs in the substances, trial and error in their baths. You've got kids still overdosing. The overdose rate's gone through the roof. You've got areas around Leicester that's actually coming in and they're having meetings saying that their drug problem is escalating, the rural areas. So yeah, Lincoln. Saying Leicester, I'm bringing you down. I'm only here for 5 minutes. You won't let me out again. But like it's like so you've got this. It looks perfect in the town centre of Lincoln. But around the edges, we're seeing what's happening, and they're having enforcement days where they double up the number of police there to remind us that it's illegal now, and that you've got to move on. So yeah, and the PCC said that the whole idea of doing that was to actually image and finance. Now you get £150 fixed penalty if you get caught with substances on you, and you get a stop and search. If you don't pay that, the first time you get a fine, you can get. It was going to be that you would get your first fine waived if you went to treatment and engaged successfully in treatment. But now that's not making so much money, is it? That's not going to pay for the lies that they're selling. So what they've done is now you get a discount of your first fine if you engage with the local drug service successfully. Yeah. If you don't engage, then when they stop you again, if you haven't paid, it doubles. You get another £150 on top. So, I mean, at the end of the day, they've made £700 out of two prosecutions so far, And on top of that, you've got to make another 20. You've got to pay another £20 for a victim surcharge. What's that about?
I mean, because I'm not going to, don't please, because I know you'll be able to answer this question as well. I'm not going to put it to you as a question, but something, and we could go on about this all day, but what you're making me think
We're here
now,
all night anyway,
I was at a conference the other week, and it was to do with drug addiction within prisons, which was just like, oh my God, yeah, you're probably gonna get what you want in prison easier than what you're gonna get out here. It was almost like it was kind of what I was hearing about it, even when the guy was on the BBC and he was there in this documentary, and he laid it out all over the table, and he said, right, this is what I sell. And I thought, wow, do you know what I mean? And you're probably more a victim in prison nowadays, I would say, than you are actually out here.
Yeah, let's send them to prison, give them a spice at it. I mean, you've got to look at that in perspective now. If we can't control drugs inside the prison system, how the hell can we control them outside? We need to regulate.
Do you want to make some comments, Jude, about Naloxone or about some of the issues of decriminalisation and legalisation?
Yeah, it's the Naloxone issue is probably what I'm to talk about. And in Leicester, I know people think that there's a big problem with getting it out there, but in Leicester we actually have got it out there to the drug using population, and it has actually worked. And what it does is, there's a counter argument to say if you give people naloxone, it encourages drug use because people will use and then get rid of it and then use again and get rid of it, and that kind of pattern. That actually isn't true. What it actually does is it empowers people to take control over their own life, and if they possibly do go over accidentally. And one client came to me last week and said he'd used it on himself. And again, a lot of people said, oh, you can't possibly use it on yourself, but that is proven to be not true. And what it does is it empowers the person to help other people, which is ultimately an aim. We want people to think about other people as well as themselves. In Leicester and Leicestershire, actually, the naloxone issue is so well known in our client group now that it's become a norm, and it doesn't actually encourage any drug use. What it actually does is get people to debate the issue about opiate overdoses and what they can do to help their friends, their family.
I mean, if you look at overdoses, I mean, previously, like if somebody hadn't got naloxone, and I know this from my own experiences, when people have overdosed and died, people have either like been charged for involuntary manslaughter, or they, and I know this from a couple of cases, they've picked the body up, gone and picked it up and dumped it round the corner, just like a sack of meat. But if somebody's got naloxone, you could be saving somebody's life, couldn't you, really?
Well, that's what it's about. It's about saving somebody's life so they can better their life and not be in the position. But also we've got the police on board with it, and a lot of police officers have administered naloxone as on the first point of contact, and then followed that up with visits to the person to make sure they're all right. The police are fully on board with it, and it is a really popular thing. It isn't overused. It's very cheap. A drug-related death costs thousands and thousands of pounds, where a naloxone kit costs £6. And
I mean, plus you can't really even put a figure on of somebody's life, can you?
No, you can't put a figure on it, and it's not just about the money, it's about the emotional cost that somebody's life could have been saved by a very, very simple thing. And it doesn't mean that you inject that into you and then you continue on your merry way in the community. You do have to support it with first aid and going possibly to hospital, and all of those interventions can get somebody to realise, well, actually that wasn't, something went on there. I've helped my friend. I feel part of the community. I feel part of these people trying to help people. It is a really, really worthwhile thing, and it is out there in Leicester and Leicestershire, and I think we've done really well with it in this city and in the county to get it to where it is.
I mean, I'm going to go back to Tom here. Yeah, I know you spoke quite a bit, and I'm going to talk about the kind of, like, how would you tackle, well, Tom and Kev, how would you kind of, all of you, tackle like the problems of addiction, like within like a decriminalised, legalised system?
Well, I think that's a very good question, because addiction is a very complex issue and it requires a complex response. What we mustn't do is fall into the trap of thinking, oh, well, 12 weeks in a residential unit, tick the box and everything's sorted. And sadly, people who go through that process often will go back to the circumstances that they left, and they will go back to problematic drug use, and that simply isn't a good enough answer. I just wanted to pick up on something that Kevin said earlier about the divisiveness. And I know this as a police officer. If a police officer wants to get somebody, they think, oh, the drug laws are brilliant because I can stop people, I can harass people, I can turn their pockets out, and if I find a little bit of dope or whatever it is, then I can use that and I've got them. So you've got a whole section of the community alienated by the police. And the original motivation behind President Nixon's declaration of a war on drug, and drugs being enemy number one in 1971 in the States, was, and this is on record now, was to get the blacks and the Mexicans. So, it's got racist origins, and frankly, that's a real issue at the moment because it's very disproportionate arrests, prosecutions and imprisonment of people, of basically black people, as compared to the white community, even though the drug consumption is less. Okay, so turning to addiction. It is a complex issue, and one thing I've discovered, I hadn't done research when I was a cop, but since then I've looked at work done by others, and it seems that a very large number of people who end up with problematic drug abuse, and I include alcoholism, but things like heroin and crack cocaine addiction and other substances, have actually suffered childhood abuse, physical, sexual, emotional, and basically they're feeling a massive amount of pain. And when they take heroin or when they drink or whatever it is, that pain goes away. It's not a solution because the underlying issues are still there, but it feels good. And then they get trapped in addiction.
I know for a fact, like, I spoke to a psychiatrist at used to be Paget House, and he was telling me that if you say, like, heroin sometimes, all right, it's got this connotation to being a horrible, terrible substance, but if you use it, it can actually act as an antipsychotic to stop people having psychotic episodes. I mean, like...
Well, let's come back to the fact that the criminals are in charge of this market at the moment. There are people, and there are trials that have taken place throughout the world, and particularly in Switzerland for over 15, 16, probably 17 years now, they've been prescribing heroin to heroin users. And those people don't use street heroin. They don't rob and burgle to fund their habit. They can actually stabilise their lives, address some of the underlying psychological issues, and actually be a productive member of society. Now, there's a great book by a man called Johann Hari called Chasing the Scream, and I urge everybody to read that because it gives you a factual but compassionate account of what has happened over the history, the failed history of prohibition over the last 30 or 40 years. But I'm not sure if anybody is aware of the concept of rat park. And by rat, I mean things that are bigger than mice, to be clear. We're talking about rats here. And there was an experiment done which, in theory, proved that heroin was addictive. Because they gave the rat, on its own in a cage, a choice between water and water with heroin. And the rat chose the heroin water. Again and again and again. But another scientist came along and he said, this doesn't seem like normal life. So he created a thing called Rat Park, where rats were able to communicate in a community with themselves. They had a number of rats there in a group, men, women. They could live a normal life. They had interesting things to do. And what was fascinating is that they virtually stopped, even the so-called addicted rats, they stopped using the heroin water. And they just went for normal water. When you put them back on their own, then they went back to the heroin. So there's growing scientific understanding that addiction isn't just about, take the substance and get addicted. It's about whole life circumstances. And the addiction rate for people who use heroin is, people might think this is very low, it's about 30%. So there are 70% of people who use heroin. And examples would be in the Vietnam War, the American servicemen were using heroin to a very large extent because the war was such an awful experience for them. But what they did when they came back to their loved ones, to their families, they came back for a reason to live They gave up their addiction. So as I said, addiction is extremely complex. One other point, if I may, have you heard about the idea of the Good Samaritan? And the problem that I think you referred to in your question, which is that when people overdose, the people who are with them, if you're in a community, won't call the ambulance because the police will arrive and prosecute them. And if that doesn't happen here, and I hope it does, you should set up a Good Samaritan scheme, which means that if, as a user, one of your mates collapses, passes out after injecting heroin, you should be able to call the police, call 999 and an ambulance, and not have the police turn up. It's being the Good Samaritan, because as you say, and I've seen this myself, you find bodies in the street because the people didn't want to be arrested. Now, if prohibition is a policy that lets human beings let somebody die rather than get arrested, we've got to change it. I mean, this is just mad. And I tell you, I'm an expert on madness. I was a chief constable. I was in the police for 30 years. And I'll tell you what, it was in many ways, let me say this, I did more harm than good as a police officer in terms of drug law enforcement. And I know that, and it wasn't because I'm a bad person or my colleagues are bad people. It's just that the law, this crazy prohibition of drugs law, turns police officers into people who actually do more harm than good, and we need to stop it.
In response to one of the questions, if people overdose, people get very scared and run away, think they're going to get arrested, and which results in what Tom has just said, bodies lying in the street. That is generally not what happens these days. It's the issue is about saving the life, and I think in Leicester and Leicestershire we are quite lucky that the police are on board with that, and people aren't penalised for calling an ambulance and the police, and we encourage people through the new use of naloxone to stay with the person. They're less likely to run away. They're more likely to be praised for helping that person by the police, by the ambulance service. It will save them an awful lot of bother in the long run. So we do have that on board, and I do understand what Thomas just said, but it isn't like that anymore. I think it does vary from place to place, but I think with our issue with naloxone is we have police on board, we have ambulances on board, people understand what we're talking about, and it has changed massively. Obviously it varies from place to place.
Thanks for that, Jude. And what you were saying about the Rat Park, I've heard about that experiment, and that's it's really helpful that you mentioned that. I think that it's worth just pointing out that it is about, you know, many people mention this, that recovery itself as a concept, and in all of its forms I say recovery. A lot of people don't even like that term, but drug and alcohol issues in all of its wide variety, it is really, there is a call for it to become a new step forward in terms of civil rights. It's a massive, massive subject. People really need to be walking up about it. And yeah, human rights and survival and poverty alienation, the inequalities in society and how that affects on it. So it's just such an enormous subject, and there is an aspect of pushing against the seams, and you know, that's why it's such a valuable discussion.
There is a political problem, which is that the main political issues politicians are concerned about are things like immigration and the economy and maybe education and health. The fact is that drug law reform doesn't impact that many people who are in a position to sort of make a noise and to change the law. So we have a real problem where I think probably most people round this table understand that this is a really serious issue, and people are losing their lives, and it's costing us billions to enforce it, and we're giving billions to criminals and all those issues. But actually one of the big challenges for us, and you asked me about how do we get people to change their minds, is we need to get politicians to understand that actually this is a big deal, that they could really make a difference, and they could actually make a big financial difference if only they looked at it properly.
Yeah, I think people need to understand people when they're on drugs, and it's not that easy when you're addicted to drugs or even addicted to cigarettes and these substances to come off just like that. You need help, and I think they should create a government body what understands people's problem and not judge them, but look for ways to help them to get back to normal.
Okay, thank you, Fred. I don't think, personally, I don't think, I think it's only been recent over the last so many years I actually saw drug addiction as an illness anyway, so wow, bit of a breakthrough there. But yeah, I think we've got probably about 5 minutes just to reflect back over that after this track. I'm not going to play the whole track because it's about 6 minutes long, but we'll just finish off with that and then we'll call the show quits because I think we've come to an end, and see if we can get some more people involved in this discussion. Okay, we'll see you on the other side.